What's going on, YouTube? It's about time to talk about Mona again. And yes, I'm using her alternate skin because I'm not out of control levels of horny. Looking at you, Twitch chat. I'm a really big fan of Mona because I like pointy hats, but also she's extremely relatable. Not in the idea of following star signs and constellations or anything, but just in the fact that I'm terribly broke. Today, I'm going to be going over everything you need to know about Mona's kit and builds in detail, so that way you can take full advantage of this astrologer after you lose your 50-50. Before we get started though, if you enjoy this type of video, make sure to leave a like so YouTube knows the video doesn't suck, and consider subscribing. We're almost to 100k subscribers, and it would mean the world to me if we could get that number before the end of summer. With all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Mona. So the first thing to know about Mona is that there are tons of Mona playstyles. You can play her in a forward vaporize team where Mona triggers reactions, you can play her in reverse vape where Xiangling triggers the reaction, you can play her in a taser setup, you can play her in a nuke team for one-shotting bosses, or you can play her as a support for freeze. She's a pretty versatile unit as a result of all that. Though there are characters that do a better job of being a hydro damage dealer, she's got support capabilities that are completely unique to her. In the interest of time, I won't be going over every build for all 5 playstyles in this video. I'll just be focusing on vaporize teams and support Mona, but I'll be going in depth about builds so you understand why each thing is best. So this video is just going to cover Vape Mona, which is going to be abusing charged attacks to get vaporizes, and support Mona, which will fit into basically any team. With that being said, let's talk about Mona's kit. In just a second, after this short message from our sponsor. This video was brought to you by Dungeon Fighter Online, a 2D multiplayer online RPG. In Dungeon Fighter Online, you explore and fight through many different action-packed dungeons and raids with players from all over the world. There are over 60 class advancements to choose from, and you'll definitely find one to match your style. I actually picked Demon Slayer for the plot. The level cap update recently happened, and it bumped max level from 100 to 110. With it comes more story, new gear, and new locations and dungeons to explore. There's tons of free goodies for starting the game right now, including a level 100 power level event, where you're going to be able to reach level 100 from level 1 in a super short amount of time. And as you level during the event, you get tons of free gear with your levels. Look, I never play these kinds of games. This was my first time really even playing a 2D fighting game, let alone one based around dungeons, and it was honestly a blast to learn combos and shred through enemies. I had a ton of fun. If you're interested, click the link in the description to get started in Dungeon Fighter Online. It's completely free, and I highly recommend you give it a try. Once again, the link is in the description, and don't forget to redeem the coupon code Welcome to DFO Gift to get some free goodies whenever you make your character. Thank you, DFO, for sponsoring, and let's get back to it. As the only non-healer Hydro Catalyst, Mona has some pretty cool features. First off, her charged attack scaling is pretty decent. It means that she can actually output okay damage in forward vaporize. Her elemental skill is a taunt that deals a small bit of damage over time, and you can press the skill to place the taunt right where the nearest enemy you're targeting is, or you can just hold her skill to move backwards and place her skill where she was just standing. Now the cool thing is that the skill actually has iframes too, so you can dodge hits with it if you're pretty good at the game. The cooldown is about 12 seconds, and it generates 3 to 4 particles after exploding, which honestly causes a couple problems for Mona's energy. By the time the taunt blows up, you're likely not going to have Mona on field to pick up the particles, but we'll talk about how to fix that in the build section. One other thing to note is that Mona's Hydro application with her taunt isn't super great. She can still apply Hydro to enemies and be played in freeze teams, but they're not going to stay frozen between each tick like they would with Kokomi. That's why a lot of players prefer Kokomi in freeze setups. Now, Mona's burst is the best part of her kit. It does a few things. It applies a debuff to enemies that makes your team deal extra damage to enemies, applies Hydro, traps smaller enemies, and explodes for massive damage. When you cast her burst, she'll apply a bubble effect to enemies. When you deal any damage that affects poise, the bubble will pop and deal high damage to the enemies affected. Now, when enemies are frozen, cryo and hydro hits won't actually affect their poise, which means that the bubble won't pop if you freeze them with Mona. All you have to do is have cryo applied to them first, and then use her burst, and that will freeze them with the omen debuff, and you'll be able to get the full duration out of it. Because one thing that the skill doesn't mention is that her damage bonus she grants against marked enemies actually starts as soon as the bubble hits enemies, but doesn't need to actually be popped. So essentially, you can freeze enemies using Mona's Omen, and if you keep them frozen long enough, her bubble will pop on its own after 8 seconds, and at talent 8, you could keep the damage bonus for a total of 13 seconds. 8 from the bubble, 5 from the leftover Omen duration. Her burst also has a short cooldown, so she brings a ton of value to freeze teams. One last thing is that her burst applies Hydro twice, once on the cast blast and once on the bubble pop. So hypothetically, if you wanted to vaporize with Mona, you could use Bennett's burst, which would apply pyro to the enemy, use Mona's burst to cancel out the pyro aura, wait a couple of seconds for internal cooldown, and then use Bennett's skill to pop the bubble, which is going to apply pyro to the enemy again right before Mona's bubble pops and applies hydro for a huge hit of vaporized damage. Mona is a super high skill ceiling character that gets carried by knowledge of her kit, so as long as you know what she does and how her burst works, you're going to be able to get a lot of value out of her. Now, outside of her normal abilities, her first Ascension passive will create taunts if you sprint for more than 2 seconds, and her second Ascension passive gives Mona hydro damage bonus based on 20% of her energy recharge, which makes it easier to play her as a support and get bonus damage out of her. Essentially, that just means that if you're going for uptime on her, you're losing a bit of damage, but it's not as much damage as you could be losing because she can actually take advantage of some of the energy recharge as hydro damage bonus. Mona is definitely an underrated character in everyday play, and that's half due to Kokomi existing, but also partially due to people not understanding her kit. So I hope I explained it fairly well, and if you need a reminder, feel free to skip back a bit in the video. As far as talent priority goes, you want to prioritize her burst most of the time since it affects the Omen duration, Omen strength, and damage scaling up until level 8. That being said, if you have her on-field dealing damage, you can also focus on her basic attacks first. Her skill isn't useless, but generally you just don't really need to level it, so it should be your last priority. Now, before we get into weapons and builds, I want to talk to you guys about Constellations. There's one thing that everyone should know going into Mona Constellations, but also we can go over the value of each one. So luckily with Mona, you don't really need Constellations for her to be good, but I want to talk about a few important things with Constellations for her. First off, her Constellation 1 is pretty good, but there's some poor wording on it. All electrocharged, vaporize, and hydro swirl damage is increased by 15% when you hit an enemy that has Omen on them, and supposedly your freeze duration should be extended by 15% as well. Well, the thing is, the freeze duration only extends if you activate the freeze with Mona's hydro application from Omen, which essentially means that if you go hydro to cryo, it won't work, but if you go from cryo to hydro, it will work. On top of that, there's a weird interaction with the vaporized damage bonus where Mona's first bubble pop won't get the bonus, but any bubble pops after the first one will get the bonus. Honestly, I hope they fix her C1 or clarify what it was actually meant to be alongside some of Keqing's constellations, but so far that doesn't really seem like their plan. Just know that it's not exactly as it reads. Next up, Mona's Constellation 2 makes it so that normal attacks have a chance to be followed up by a charged attack automatically. Overall, this ends up being an okay damage increase for on-field Mona and doesn't really interfere with forward vape setups. Her Constellation 3 increases her burst level by 3, and her C4 gives your party more crit rate against enemies with Omen. Her C5 increases her taunt level by 3, and her C6 makes her on-field damage a little bit higher by giving her a damage bonus to her next charged attack after she sprints. Now, the problem with C6 is that you don't really want to spend a ton of time sprinting if you're trying to clear content fast. You'll usually be able to get at least 60% of the 180% of their charged attack damage bonus, but most of the time you're not really going to see more than that, and so it's a little bit deceptive. At least in Spiral Abyss, you're not going to be using C6 a lot, but in the overworld, you might find that you just get insane damage, and it's really funny. Overall, Mona Constellations are pretty decent for the most part, so if you happen to get another one of her constellations from losing the first Sumeru 50/50, you'll still be getting value. However, I wouldn't go in on a banner to try and get Mona Constellations for her, because while they are decent, and they do slightly affect her damage output, they're not so good that I would actively look for them. And just a reminder, she is good without them. Next up, let's talk about weapons for DPS Mona and support Mona. So just be aware there's about 1 billion weapons that Mona can use, and she will likely be able to use a lot of newer ones that come out in the future. So I really don't want to go over every single one because then the video would be like 50 minutes long, but I do want to mention some of the better ones of both the 5 stars and the 4 stars. So for a DPS build, for Mona on field, your best 5-star option is going to be Lost Prayer of Sacred Winds, which is essentially going to give you stacks of elemental damage bonus. However, it does have a downside, and it's that its stacks reset whenever you leave the field. So the only way this is good is if she's on field dealing damage for more than 4 seconds at a time. Outside of that and the crit rate it gives, it can actually get beaten out by other 5-star weapons as well, like Kagura's Verity and Skyward Atlas. Now, Kagura's Verity will see the most value in Electrocharged and Freeze, since you can use Mona's skill there, but you don't really want to use her skill in Vaporized teams, so in that case, she'll get less value out of Kagura's. And again, Skyward Atlas is just decent all around. Now, Memory of Dust isn't really bad, but most of the time Mona isn't going to have a shield, so you're gonna miss out on a lot of its passive, and it might as well just be a 4-star at that point. So the other 5-star options end up being a lot better for consistency, and I would highly recommend those ones. However, there's a 4-star weapon that I prefer over some of the 5-stars, and that's the Widsith. It basically outperforms every 5-star when its passive is on, because it's going to give you a massive attack buff, a massive elemental mastery buff, or a massive elemental damage buff. When I say massive, I mean huge. Like, it is an absurd amount of damage bonus, attack percent, or elemental mastery, but it only lasts for about 10 seconds. Because it has a 30-second cooldown before you can use that effect again, 5-stars are actually better overall weapons and more flexible and consistent. But if you're looking to just nuke content, Widsith is pretty good for that and definitely really fun. It also has a crit damage main stat, which makes it easier overall to build crit on your Mona. And if you don't have any 5-star weapons, but you have this one, I definitely recommend it. Now, Solar Pearl from the Battle Pass also works, and if you're a free-to-play player, Map of Mare is going to be your best DPS choice if you don't have access to others, since it's going to have an EM main stat that'll help with both Vape and Electrocharge teams, and its passive gives elemental damage bonus. On top of that, Map of Mare is craftable, so if you want to, you can refine it and get higher elemental damage bonus, but I would also hold out if you're going to craft anything, because it's possible that whatever weapons released in Sumeru could also be pretty good on Mona. Overall, though there are other DPS weapons you can use, I recommend all of the ones we just talked about. Now, for support weapons though, it's a different story. You do still want Mona to deal damage, and since her scaling on her burst is so high and she gets the Omen debuff to put on enemies and increase her damage, she will hit pretty hard, and so you do want to invest into her in that way. However, you can also opt to use weapons that are less optimal for her but help out the rest of your team. For example, you can use Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers to give a massive attack buff to the character you switch to after Mona. It does take away a big part of her damage, but it ends up being worth it most of the time because it gives your Ganyu or Ayaka a huge boost if you're playing Morgana, and any characters that can snapshot that attack buff will take a lot of advantage of that weapon. Now, outside of Thrilling Tales, you can opt for Sacrificial Fragments, which essentially is going to give you 2 elemental skills to use. After canceling the first one, it instantly gives you energy, so it helps Mona with energy generation as well. Favonius Codex also gives energy recharge and has a chance to generate white particles when you crit, so either Sacrificial or Favonius will help Mona get her burst back, but Favonius is likely a little bit better, especially because it can battery other characters on your team as well. And lastly, you can also give Mona Prototype Amber if you want to make her a pseudo healer and also battery her more. I don't really like Prototype Amber personally, but it's really not that bad. The passive of it basically gives Mona 20% of her burst back after casting it, and it'll heal up your team a tiny bit. At Refinement 5, it becomes a lot more valuable too. I would personally take a weapon that helps you deal more damage while keeping uptime over Amber, but it's an option nonetheless. Again, there are tons of weapons that Mona can take advantage of, but these are the ones that I found to be the most effective, at least when I was playing Mona a lot recently. So next up, let's talk about different ways to build Mona and which one you should go for. As usual, I have a bit of a disclaimer if you're pre-AR45. If you haven't reached AR45 yet, you don't want to spend resin farming artifacts because you're not guaranteed to get a 5-star every run until you unlock the highest level artifact domains. So instead, you'll want to just throw together a combination of Exile or any 18% attack set in the meantime. Energy recharge and attack are going to be your best friend with low-level Mona. In the meantime, here are some stat options. Again, attack and energy recharge are going to be the easiest and most rewarding way to build her until you really start maxing out the character. However, once you get to AR45, you can choose to build her as a damage dealer, or you can choose to build her as a support. As a damage dealer, Mona is actually one of the very few characters that's able to forward vaporize consistently. Now, forward vaporize, I've said it a lot in this video, all it means is applying hydro to an enemy that already has pyro on them to get double the hydro damage, which is opposed to what you normally see called reverse vape, where you apply pyro to someone that has hydro on them and get a 1.5 times multiplier. While this sort of thing can be hard to set up, it's a lot of fun if you know how to play the character right. Now, if you're playing Mona as a DPS, you have a few options for artifact sets. For forward vaporize, I personally recommend the 4-piece Wanderer's Troop set for the huge charge attack bonus and elemental mastery, since for a forward vape setup, all you're going to be doing is abusing charged attacks and spamming charged attack over and over as your team reapplies pyro. But you can also opt for a combination of 2-piece Wanderers, Heart of the Depth, or 18% attack pieces. Emblem is also fine here, but if you're going to have Mona Mona on field dealing damage, you'd be better off using one of the other sets. If you're playing Mona in a reverse vaporized setup though, where Xiangling is the one getting vaporized rather than Mona, you're likely going to opt for one of the 2-set combos or 4-piece Heart of the Depths, since you'll be focusing on total hydro damage output, and elemental mastery won't matter for Mona if she's not the one causing the vaporize. That being said, I don't really recommend reverse vaporize on Mona as much, because there are so many other characters that just do it better, like Xingqiu, Child, Kokomi, or Yelan if you have the option. So in general, I think it's really cool that she can use forward vape, and I would highly recommend that over reverse vape for her. Now, you might be wondering about 4-piece Heart of the Depth, Shimenawa, or the Retracing Bolide set, since they all give higher charge attack bonus than Wanderer's Troop. The main reason I don't recommend Bolide is because you're not really likely to be playing Mona with a shield in forward vaporized teams, and though there are exceptions to that, it's just most of the time you're not going to want to. But the reason for not recommending Shimenawa is because of its effect. You have to use an elemental skill to activate Shimenawa's damage bonus, and when you do, you're going to lose 15 energy. Mona's elemental skill can steal vaporizes from Mona, which will significantly lower your overall damage output. But also, since this actually takes energy away from Mona, you can lower your overall team damage since you're not going to be using her burst and getting a bunch of damage bonus. This also applies to Heart of Depth, since it requires you to use your skill. In a forward vaporized team, it's just not a good idea. However, there is one exception though, and that's going to be your taser setup. You'll still want to use her burst, but you can also use Heart of Depth for the huge damage bonus and also be able to use her skill at the same time. For DPS stats, the easiest stats to build will be attack, hydro damage, and crit rate or damage. It's important to note that energy recharge does not give her as much damage as just building her for attack. The ER to hydro damage bonus is meant to be just that, a bonus, not necessarily something to replace attack with. For that reason, you may see that you build ER with her on a support setup, but for main DPS or just for on-field damage dealing or nuking, you're not going to really use energy recharge. Now, you can actually make her damage in vaporized teams higher by giving her an elemental mastery sands instead of an attack one, and I recommend trying it if you have a good EM sands, but just know that an EM sands is only better in forward vaporized with Mona, and it's not really worth it in taser. Lastly, for substats, focus on crit rate and damage up until you're at least 50 crit rate and 100 crit damage. Then you can focus on energy recharge, attack, and elemental mastery. Because Mona is actually on field, she'll be picking up a lot more particles, and so her energy recharge needs in a main DPS position are a lot lower. That doesn't mean energy recharge is bad, but she doesn't really need nearly as much, since she'll be picking up HP particles and particles from all your character's skills and her own skill. But now let's talk about a support build for Mona. If you're not really a DPS Mona enthusiast, you're likely opting for support Mona. Now, support Mona focuses around applying hydro, buffing your damage, and adding a bit of her own damage into the mix. To do that, you have a few artifact options. First, ask yourself if you have a Noblesse user in the team. Noblesse gives your team a 20% attack bonus after using your burst, and you want to have at least one of those in most teams, but not more than one. Mona's a pretty good candidate for Noblesse since her burst cooldown is really short and lets you use it pretty often. But if you already have a Noblesse user, you should try to opt for the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate set. Now, the main reason for that is for a support build, Mona cares more about her burst being up than anything else, and essentially, Emblem will allow you to build energy recharge on Mona to see a higher damage output with her burst. The 2-piece set gives 20% energy recharge, which is already a good bonus, but it also means that if you give her an energy recharge sands or an energy recharge weapon, or both, you're going to see an increase in her burst damage because of the set. Since she also gets damage bonus from energy recharge with her second ascension passive, you can build her with a bunch of ER and see better returns than the average character. For support Mona, this is like the dream come true perfect set. I absolutely love it and it's amazing. Now, you can also opt for some of the sets on the DPS build here, but Emblem just makes her a lot easier to build overall. Also, you do have the option of 4-piece Tenacity to give you a passive 20% attack bonus when her skill is up, but be aware that her skill doesn't have 100% uptime, so Tenacity is less useful on her than on other characters. Overall, I recommend Emblem over anything else for support Mona unless you don't have a Noblesse user already. Now, for stats, I recommend running an energy recharge sands, a hydro damage goblet, and a crit circlet. That way you can still get decent bonus damage with Mona while taking advantage of her bursts buff. Now, a few seconds ago, I talked about energy recharge for Mona, and you might be wondering, well, Brax, how much energy recharge should I have? Well, in my experience and in some calculations, for a support Mona in something like Morgana, for example, and just most of her teams in general, you're looking at around 220% or more. Her skill doesn't really generate its particles until it leaves the field, so most of the time, Mona's not going to be on field to pick those up in a support setup, and it can be harder for her to get her burst. She's not the most energy hungry character, but if you want to be safe with Mona and always have her burst, look to build at least that much for her in a support setup. And as for substats, you want to go for energy recharge up to 220%, follow that up with DPS stats like crit rate and damage and attack percent. Elemental mastery is basically useless in freeze teams, but it's not a bad stat to have in case an enemy happens to have pyro on them. It's just not the most useful one. That was a lot of information to take in, so I went ahead and made 2 example builds for you to get a visual idea of what you're looking for. The first build is a DPS Mona build featuring 4 Wanderers, attack hydro damage crit with Skyward Atlas or with Sith. If you wanted to make it even better for vaporized teams, you would run an elemental mastery Sands, but because those are pretty rare, in this example, there's an attack Sands. And for the second build, there's a 4-piece emblem build with ER, hydro damage crit, and at least 220% energy recharge with Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers or Favonius Codex. This build would be best in a freeze team like Morgana. I've had Mona for over a year now on my account, and she's always been super valuable to a lot of different teams that I've built, and just to hitting really big numbers in funny showcases. But I've really enjoyed playing her, and since her appearance in the Golden Apple Archipelago, I've had a lot more appreciation for her as a character, and I think a lot of other people have as well. In my experience playing Mona, I've really enjoyed using her as a DPS because it's sort of just a fun way to play. But with that being said, your teams are pretty restricted with Mona as an on-field DPS, whereas Mona can be fit basically into any freeze team, even with free-to-play units. I really enjoy Mona as a support and would recommend building her that way if you're debating between the two or are just new to Mona, because it's a lot easier to get value out of her as a support. Overall, I hope that you all learned something from this updated Mona guide, and hopefully you're able to find a place to slot Mona into your game. I put out a YouTube community post a little bit ago saying that I'm going to be separating teams videos from my guides just because they take a super long time and I want to get more specific with them. So I'm going to have a best teams for Mona video coming up pretty soon, and if you want to see that, make sure to subscribe so that way you can be updated on all of my newest videos. Let me know if you're using Mona in the comments below, and I'll catch you next time.